which is unmanipulated photography, is actually this, which I think is a 20th century masterpiece in photography. So his name is Alfred Stieglitz, and I came across him whilst I was actually working on my PhD. And completely by coincidence. I came across him because I read a quote by an art critic who was explicitly claiming Alfred Stieglitz has made objectivity, has brought objectivity at the center of artistic experimentation. And I thought, okay, this doesn't quite add up. How can an art critic make a case for objectivity when artists were so much against the concept of objectivity? And so I started digging a little bit, and it turns out that before becoming a photographer, Alfred Stieglitz had actually been trained in a very kind of experimentalist environment in Berlin in the 1880s. He had started a degree in engineering and then switched to chemistry and then switched to photochemistry. And being in Berlin in the 1880s was quite an experience, because the whole context was, let's bring chemistry out of the lecture room and let's bring it straight into the laboratory, okay? And that was a big, I think, it happened before the 1880s, but as a matter of fact, that was a real change of ethos in the ways in which chemistry itself was practiced. And what Alfred Stieglitz does, he's one of the main proponents of avant-garde photography. He's the guy who brings avant-garde art from Europe all the way to the United States, and he is very happy to take the consequences for this move. His work was not very well accepted at the beginning, and then he became the impresario of avant-garde in the States, but he's also one of the spokesmen for photography as a form of art in its own right. And what is interesting about Stieglitz is that he talks about photography as a form of art in its own right, but he also talks about photography as the straight, non-manipulated print, okay? And the importance, in fact, of a trained observation rather than intervening on the plates as an ethos at the basis of photography. And that is what makes his photography particularly interesting from my point of view. And so I did a little bit of digging, and it turns out that what he did eventually was he took the whole ethos of the laboratory, okay, and he basically brought it from science, from a scientific context. So the ethos, by the ethos of the laboratory, I mean when you are doing lab work unconsciously, there will be a whole set of tacit practices, there will be a whole set of ways of observing things that are not just individual observations, but are in fact the product of a collective negotiation. And even just the practice of laboratory work will allow you to train your eye to see things in a way that is obviously sort of in conformity with the science and with what you're trying to find. And what Stieglitz does is he takes this kind of ethos of observing together and learning by doing, and he brings it right at the center of his photographic galleries, which he establishes in New York at the beginning of the century. So much so that he calls his photographic galleries his experimental stations. And you find a lot of people talking about these galleries as laboratories, okay? This is a laboratory where we are experimenting with photography. And there is a clear experimentalist angle on what these people are doing, and they take that very seriously. And by experimentation, I don't just mean manipulating materials, because at the time, if you were a photographer, you had to be able, essentially, to know the chemicals and the chemistry behind photography. It wasn't as easy as it might be somehow nowadays. But also there is a sense in which if you want to take the perfect photograph, for Stieglitz you have to be a trained observer. And the very idea of a trained observer is in fact something that he borrows from science, brings back into art, and then he uses it in order to argue against a naive idea of objectivity. So his idea is, if we think about objectivity as this kind of correspondence between our representations, or as a kind of cutting off subjectivity from our representations, then we are making a big mistake. because if there is anything such as objectivity in observation, that is essentially the kind of collective way of observing and the intersubjective agreements that allow us to take the perfect photograph, or that allow us to recognize something as scientifically interesting, basically. And that is, I think, the main message that I want to take from Stiglitz, and that is also the main message behind the photograph that I have circulated, which has always been interpreted as a photograph about class and about social segregation. It's called the steerage for a reason. You've got the rich people upstairs and the poor people with no way out at the bottom. But what Stiglitz says about this picture is I saw shapes relating to each other, and I saw somehow a pattern, and it was only when the guy in the straw hat bent his head that that kind of configuration made sense to me. And that sounds very much close to the way in which a lot of scientists actually report their experiences of having these data sets and then eventually spotting patterns into data. And I think this is very much a result of the kind of training that Stiglitz had through art. So I want to just conclude with a final bit and with an example which unfortunately is not very beautifully printed because my printer ran out of toner, so it's in black and white, which is a bit appalling. But it's a more contemporary example, and it is a colleague of mine from the UCL, the Slade School of Art at UCL. And with this I want to think about essentially what is the next frontier for these art and science collaborations. So we've seen with Albinos that there is the possibility of artists interfering productively with the science and coming up with something which is quite of an outstanding quality. We've seen with Stiglitz artists interfering with some of the theoretical convictions underpinning science. This next image is essentially it's a very, very interesting piece that comes as a follow-up of this book, which is called Data Soliloquies. It's a very, very short book, and it's about the kind of rhetoric that accompanies sort of climate change talk. Okay, and it's two artists in residence who are trying to question what scientists would take as granted, and that's the idea of data. Okay. We tend to think about, I hear a lot actually, of talk about, well, data is the most foundational building block of science. Nowadays, science is done in a very data-driven kind of way, so you've got a lot of talk about huge data sets. If you browse the past issues of Wired magazine in 2008, you will stumble on a relatively outrageous article by the then editor, which is called The End of Theories, and the claim there is now that we have the data, correlation supersedes causation, we can do away with our theories, we can do away with our models, we've got the numbers, that's all we need. Okay. And I want to take a bit of a polemical angle, and I think art is quite a good way of, and I think the title of this book is actually brilliant. Data are not self-evident. And what we are arguing, what these artists are arguing again, is the idea that we can take data at face value and just take them as granted. So what this particular piece is about is, in fact, this is a visualization of data that were initially numerical data. It's cloud patterns as they cover the Earth on a particular day in February 2007, and it's data taken from all the cloud monitoring satellites from NASA and the European Space Agency. And then these data have been sort of reconstructed in a 3D model, which has then been 3D printed. Okay? And the assumption behind that is data have no voice whatsoever unless we find a way of visualizing them. They would speak for themselves, they would remain as monologues unless we find a way of finding patterns through the data. And finding patterns through the data means that we are somehow making some kind of judgment or choice, okay, in terms of relevance, in terms of how to model them. And this is one of those magical instances in which, in fact, I think the kind of challenges that come from art make the science better, okay? They make the science better because they kind of unveil assumptions. Think about data and how much scientists take data for granted. They really bring out the assumptions that really scientists would just not question anymore. And I think this is a very, very important role for art. So the way I want to conclude this is in a slightly polemic vein. My favorite artist, Pablo Picasso, once said that art is not made to decorate apartments. And my take on this is that art is not made to decorate laboratories either. So when we frame an artist in residence program as we take an artist, we put the artist in a corner of a lab, we might ask them to paint a wall. That qualifies as an artist in residence program. I think we are really missing a big opportunity. And so mine is a call to action to artists to really, really engage in not so much it's not so much the patronizing idea of you should learn the science. It's more the idea of art is very much like philosophy in this respect. It's about questioning the science, because it's the process of questioning that in fact makes science better. And on the other hand, I want to make my call to actions open to scientists in terms of really thinking about what is it that goes into science, whether we want it or not, independently of the kind of criteria for exactitudes that we establish for our science. And there is a sense in which art and science really get together once we construe them both as the pursuit of knowledge. And it's in fact very different forms of knowledge, but it's from the interaction of these different forms of knowledge that new things happen. And so probably I'll leave it at that and see if there are any responses.
Okay, thank you very much, Chiara, for that engaging talk. I'm sure everyone loved it. We are going to have now a 20 minutes break in which you are welcome to eat the sandwiches that are coming. Refill your glasses and also play our Cosy Science game. This time, because Chiara has been speaking about how artists are helping scientists, I just wanted to bring the opposite and how science can help artists just by playing anagrams. I don't know if you know what an anagram is. So it's a kind of word rearrangement into one type of word to another. So for example, I just have here, the anagram Amen Jobs hides the fictional character